Hi, this is Emerald and welcome to the Diamond Net, and today I'm going to be talking to you about victims mentality and an equally problematic mindset that I call anti-victims mentality. Alright, so in this video, I'm going to be talking about two equally problematic mindsets, one that's spoken about quite often and the other that's much less known. So one is victims mentality, and we all kind of know that victims mentality isn't a good thing. So victims mentality is where a person gets into a false sense of powerlessness and gets into learned helplessness, and they may even play the victim for a certain type of attention. Now, on the other side of the spectrum, we have anti-victims mentality. This is where a person sees other people with victims mentality and says, oh, I don't want to be anything like that. And what ends up happening is that they start to ignore all of their genuine pain and genuine vulnerabilities in order to avoid seeming like they're playing the victim. Now, both victims mentality and anti-victims mentality are like two unhealthy poles on one spectrum. And so what we want to do is we want to find a place in the middle of that spectrum between the two, where we're not polarizing to one side or the other, and we're taking the most positive elements of both of these polarities. And yes, there are positive things about victims mentality and anti-victims mentality. But what we want to do is we want to discard the negative things about both of these perspectives. So let's go into each one of these mindsets in depth. So we're first going to start out by talking about victims mentality, what it is, why people engage in it, what the effects of victims mentality are, as well as what's needed most when somebody's in victims mentality. So we're going to start first with victims mentality. We're going to talk about what it is, why people engage in it, what the effects are, and also what's most needed to get out of victims mentality. And then what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing for anti-victims mentality. So victims mentality is when a person identifies as the victim, and they may feel powerless to make things better in their life and feel like they're at the mercy of the world. Now, when someone's in victims mentality, they can genuinely feel very stuck in life and feel like they don't have any levers of power at their disposal, even if there are many outlets for power at their hands. And they may also start to look at other people as villains and sort of cast them in the role of villain in their story so that they can kind of play the victim in relation to that villain. And these feelings of persecution can be there even if no boundary breach has occurred. And there are many different conscious and unconscious motives as to why someone might be in victims mentality. One reason that someone might be in victims mentality is because they've internalized the idea that they're genuinely powerless. And this can typically come up in childhood, from parents maybe communicating to the child that they're powerless in some way or feeling stuck in a certain circumstance. The second motive is that they're trying to avoid responsibility. With responsibility, there can be a lot of overwhelm, and so a person might go into victims mentality because they really don't want to face with the overwhelm and the burden of that responsibility. And the third motive is that they want to play the victim in relation to a villain so that they have someone to scapegoat. Oftentimes when a person is dealing with shame, they're going to look for somebody else that they can kind of project that shame onto. And so when a person plays the victim, they can pretend to be the perfect victim, and then they choose another person to be the perfect villain in order to take out that sense of shame on. Another motive for victims mentality is to avoid accountability for their negative actions. So it's another way of avoiding responsibility, but in this case, it's the case that they've done something that they maybe deep down feel ashamed of or they feel remorse for, but instead of facing with that, it's like they look to another person to blame for their own actions. Now, another motivation for victims mentality is that the victim is associated with goodness. So it's the idea that when someone is a victim, they're the innocent, they're the good one. And so for a person also who's dealing with shame, oftentimes they'll want to create an identity of goodness to be able to reassure themselves that they are worthy, that they're okay, that they're good and not bad. And so a person might come to identify with the victim because they can kind of play through a story where they're a good person or they're the good one because they're in that victim role. And another reason for victim's mentality can be that they're trying to get someone to save them. So if a person, let's say, maybe had parents that were somewhat neglectful and didn't take care of them, later on they might try to play into this idea of like helplessness and play the victim so that somebody who identifies with the hero can come in and save them. And this is the way that they get to be cared for and taken care of, in a way that they didn't get taken care of in childhood. And along these same lines, a person might also play the victim in order to get a certain type of attention or sympathy from other people. All right, and the last motive that I'll talk about in this video for why people engage in victim's mentality is a sense of learned helplessness. So this means that if we were powerless at one point in time, like in our childhood years, and couldn't escape a certain negative circumstance, we end up carrying the idea that we're powerless even into times that we are not actually powerless against something. So an example of this would be like, let's say, captive baby elephants. They would tie the baby elephants up to a post by one of their legs, and the baby elephant would try to get away and would try to basically pull the post out of the ground, but the baby elephant wasn't strong enough to do that. But they would grow into an adult-sized elephant where they were, so much bigger and stronger to the point where they could easily pull the post out of the ground, and yet they wouldn't try and they would just stay put. And it's because the elephant has learned a sense of powerlessness. They learn that, oh no, I'm not capable of doing this, and that impression that they're not capable of pulling the post out of the ground carried into their adult life. We're also very similar to these elephants in the sense that if we're powerless in a circumstance, let's say when we're in our childhood, sometimes we'll carry that sense of powerlessness into our adult years. Now, in terms of the effects of victim's mentality on a person's life, a person might get stuck in circumstances like jobs and relationships and lifestyles that they really, really don't like and that are really, really bad for them, but they might feel powerless to actually make changes. And so they'll have a tendency to tolerate things that they shouldn't and not set boundaries where they should. And sometimes a person who's in victim's mentality they'll either consciously or unconsciously create drama and problems in their life in order to solidify their identity as the victim. And they may even sabotage themselves in order to get support and sympathy from others, and might even have a tendency to attract friends and partners who want to play the hero to their victim role, who want to try to save them. And it's through this process of falling apart and, let's say being in a negative situation and being saved from it, that the person in victim's mentality can get what it is that they're looking for. But oftentimes they will wear their friends out and kind of go over boundaries because the friends are always having to kind of pick up the pieces of their life or, be the support system for them. And then in more extreme scenarios, a person who's in victim's mentality also can be quite abusive and, find ways to kind of scapegoat the other person that they're abusing in order to absolve themselves of responsibility. Now, in terms of what's needed to get out of victim's mentality is that the person in victim's mentality has to be able to face with and acknowledge their power and to take responsibility. So power and responsibility always go together. So taking more power means taking more responsibility. Taking less power equals less responsibility. And so because there tends to be an aversion to responsibility, the person who's in victim's mentality typically rejects power. So they say, oh, I'm powerless, I'm the victim, so they're in resistance to power. So the person who's in victim's mentality has to acknowledge their own personal power and has to be able to take responsibility in their lives without kind of like, let's say, putting it out on somebody else. Now, oftentimes this dynamic can arise from a very specific kind of childhood. It's the type of childhood where the person felt like they maybe had to be responsible too young or maybe had to be responsible for their parents' emotions. And so when that type of power is put on a small child, or really any child, it's a very overwhelming kind of burdensome thing. So if the child understands that, oh, I'm responsible for my parents' happiness, or I'm responsible for my parents' emotional state, that's a lot of power to be handing to a child. And so what this does is the child, because they want to make their parent happy, they start to take on all of this responsibility responsibility for their parents' emotional state. And when the child can't influence the situation, because no child can, they feel this sense of failure in relation to the power and responsibility that's been prematurely bestowed upon them. And so the child might end up in a situation where they kind of polarize themselves away from responsibility and away from their own power and seek to stay in that state of victim's mentality. And so for the person that this describes, in order to acknowledge their own power, in order to take responsibility, they also have to work through the feelings of burden and overwhelm and shame that they have in relation to power and responsibility. Okay, so that's victim's mentality in a nutshell. I'm going to go into anti-victim's mentality in just a moment, but before that, I wanted to mention that today is the last day to enroll in my membership site, the Consciousness Workers Club. I open up enrollment once per season, and so this is the fall enrollment period, which started last Sunday and ends today at 6 p.m. Eastern. And so if you want to get into the Consciousness Workers Club, I have a link down below in the description box and in the comments. And in the Consciousness Workers Club, I host one monthly masterclass that's live that anyone can join that's a member. I also have one monthly group coaching session where if anybody in the membership has questions, they can kind of hop onto a Zoom meeting with me and I'll answer those questions in real time. And basically, it's like meant to be very interactive. And so there's also a forum element to it where, you know, people can interact with one another who are kind of like-minded, who are interested in consciousness work. There's also a growing catalog of exclusive content that you won't find on my regular channel. So if that's something that you might be interested in, there's a link down below in the description box and in the comments section. And again, today is the last day that you'll be able to enroll for the fall enrollment period. And if you don't get it by then it'll be open again in winter time in January, the first week of January. And after today, I will leave a link down below in the description box for the waiting list for the Consciousness Workers Club. All right, so without further ado, let's go into anti-victim's mentality. So in looking at victim's mentality, you can see that there are a lot of negative things and that being in victim's mentality is not a healthy thing. And ultimately, because victim's mentality is not a healthy thing, there tends to be a pretty strong reaction against it. And somebody might actually polarize themselves to the other side of the spectrum in order to get away from victim's mentality. But victim's mentality and anti-victim's mentality are honestly two sides to one coin and often come from the same kind of hurt where they were made to be responsible too young. But the difference is, while someone in victim's mentality plays up to the feelings of powerlessness and you know, looks at themselves as a victim, somebody who's in anti-victim's mentality tends to be someone who identifies with being strong and powerful and responsible, and someone who never plays the victim. And they even have very, very harsh, strong judgments toward people who are in victim's mentality. They see those in victim's mentality as weak, and they see themselves as strong by contrast. And they would feel incredibly ashamed and embarrassed to be seen as somebody who's playing the victim or trying to extract sympathy from others. And they tend to see the support given to those in victim's mentality as unearned, and they may even see the support given to those who have genuinely been in a negative circumstance or genuinely been victimized as unearned. And they might even characterize that as being in victim's mentality to acknowledge victimization. And so this makes a person with anti-victim's mentality quite callous to the suffering of others, and they may even take the side of the perpetrator in cases of injustice. Now, in the same way that there are many motivations for a person to be in victim's mentality, there are also many motivations for a person to be in anti-victim's mentality. And the first is that the person in anti-victim's mentality doesn't want to be seen as weak. People in this mindset tend to want to be seen as strong and would tend to judge other people for showing weaknesses. And so when a person is genuinely hurt or genuinely in pain, they may even just look at that as that person playing the victim, even if that person's not doing that, or it's just that person showing their weakness in some way. And so they have this aversion to that weakness in others and in themselves, and they go into anti-victims mentality, and judgment toward those who are in pain or those who are vulnerable in order to hide those vulnerabilities in themselves. Another motive for anti-victims mentality is that they want to identify as the responsible one. They want to preserve this identity that they're the person that can always take responsibility in every single situation. So if somebody has victimized them, if somebody has gone over their boundaries, if somebody has caused harm to them, instead of looking at it as, oh, this person created this problem, they'll tend to go into self-blame and they'll take responsibility for something that really genuinely was out of their control because they want to feel like they're responsible for 100% of the things going on in their life. This gives them the sense that they have control even in situations where they don't have any control. And so a person who feels powerless or has traumas around not having control over things might tend to go into anti-victims mentality so that they can have this sense of ubiquitous control over their lives. Another motivation for this mindset is that they're trying to avoid a certain type of pain or hurt. So if they go into this thought that, oh, I never play the victim, I'm strong, I can always be the responsible one, it's a way basically of keeping down a certain traumas that they might have or certain things that need to be processed that they don't want to face with. And so in this way, it's somewhat similar to victims mentality. So someone in victims mentality avoids responsibility and avoids discomfort by basically playing the victim. Somebody in anti-victims mentality avoids uncomfortable emotions and, basically goes into resistance to these elements of themselves, using this identity to do so. And along similar lines, someone in anti-victims mentality might use this mentality to avoid looking at problems, both personal and societal, and to avoid fixing those problems. And so basically it's another way of avoiding responsibility, even though it takes the opposite form of victims mentality. And another reason why a person might be engaged in anti-victims mentality is that they've been genuinely victimized by someone in the past, but they don't want to see themselves as a victim. And so they try to create some other type of narrative in order to feel more like they're in control, feel more like it was their fault. And there tends to be like a lot of self-blame within this, where it's like, oh, well, I wasn't the victim. If I would have only just done this, then I would have been fine. And it was only my fault in that situation. But yeah, I'm not going to play the victim and say that it wasn't my fault because I should have been able to see it coming. It's basically along those same lines, again, of trying to get that false sense of control and power over things. And then another motive, and one of the biggest symptoms of anti-victims mentality is that they have a strong judgment and aversion toward those who are in victims mentality. Most likely it is the case that they see behaviors consciously that they don't like and they go in resistance to those behaviors. But deep down, there's a deeper link between those who are in victims mentality and those who are in anti-victims mentality. Because it's two sides to one coin. So it's similar hurts, but just polarizing to one side of the spectrum or another to cope with those hurts. And so when a person in anti-victims mentality sees someone with victims mentality, they'll tend to have a very aversive reaction to that person. All right, and the final motive for anti-victims mentality is that they feel like they genuinely can't trust others to rely on them. So this oftentimes comes from, let's say, having a not such a strong support system, maybe being raised in a family where the adults weren't very attentive or weren't very mature, and so they maybe became very independent and had to rely only on themselves. And so their idea is that, it's every person for themselves and I have to rely only on myself. I can't seek support and help from others. Now, in terms of the effects of anti-victims mentality is that they'll tend to be very callous to their own suffering and the suffering of others. And as I had mentioned before, they might have a tendency to take the side of the perpetrator over the victim and engage in victim blaming. They may even hold the notion that there's no such thing as a genuine victim and that everybody is responsible for 100% of the things that happen to them in their life. And so when it's the case that somebody is acknowledging, let's say, some kind of boundary breach or some kind of problem or some kind of genuine victimization, that person might automatically go into this idea that that person is being tricky or dishonest in some way. And they may even have the notion that the victims are the true villains because victims are the ones that are lying about their victim state in order to get support and in order to get sympathy. And where people in victims mentality want to play the victim, somebody who's an anti-victims mentality wants to play the hero. They want to be the person who comes in and basically, let's say, resolves problems and who is admired for their strength and resolve at solving those problems. But if they have to choose in the trifecta between hero, villain, and victim, they would choose the hero first, the villain second, and the very dead last would be the victim. And despite this desire to be the hero, they can be very, very contemptuous of the victim. And so in a sense, they can at once want to be the hero, but also be very callous to injustices and be very callous to people who are genuine victims. And a person with anti-victims mentality might come across like a glass cannon, somebody who's able to dish things out, but somebody who is so hardened up that they're fragile and they break very easily. And they will genuinely have like a relationship to their emotional state, which is one of overcoming. So seeing emotions as fundamentally a sign of weakness and vulnerability and as a challenge to get over, and a desire to be stoic in order to prove oneself, more strong than their emotions, not weighed down by their weaknesses, basically. And as a result of this relationship to their emotions, they may go unconscious to where their boundaries are and where their limits are, and they might always seek to overcome those boundaries and limits, and they might end up in situations that are incredibly overwhelming or harmful to them without them really being aware of it. Now, in terms of what's most needed for somebody who's in anti-victims mentality, the number one thing is for them to get in touch with their own vulnerability, their own pain, their own emotions, and to be able to acknowledge these things within themselves. The ability to be able to kind of soften up is very, very important for someone in this mindset. And they need to be able to acknowledge their own pain and the pain of others as valid. And in relation to that, they also need to be able to look to other people for support and accept support from others. They also need to surrender to the fact that a lot of things that happen to them in life are outside of their control, and the same goes for acknowledging that for other people. So if they currently have the notion that they are 100% responsible for everything that happens to them in their life, it takes on a kind of delusional sense of power over the forces of the universe that are outside of our control. And so in this way, a person has to be able to let go of that sense of control and to surrender to the forces of the things outside of our control, and to try to feel more okay with acknowledging that lack of control. And they also have to acknowledge that they're not 100% responsible for everything that happens in their life, and that there can be genuine problems that come about that aren't a person's fault. So in that way, they can extend that grace to themselves if they make a mistake or something bad happens to them, and they can extend that grace to others as well. They would also need to become aware that acknowledging one's own pain and being in victim's mentality are two totally different things. Simply acknowledging pain and hurt and other things is something that's very healthy and very necessary, whereas being in victim's mentality is having this notion that I'm a victim and I can't do anything in my life, and being bogged down in these limiting beliefs. And it's important for someone in anti-victims mentality to also realize that anti-victims mentality can be a way to avoid taking responsibility for their own problems and avoid taking responsibility for the problems in the greater society. Typically, people who have anti-victims mentality tend to want to take responsibility for things. But if they can realize that in being in that mindset, they're actually not taking responsibility for a whole great deal of things, that can oftentimes be a way to entice them more toward letting go of that mindset. All right, so we talked about victims mentality and we talked about anti-victims mentality. And what we really want is we want an integration of both of these things so that we end up with just the positive elements of both and that the negatives are tempered out by the opposite. So with regard to victims mentality, the positive elements of victims mentality are the ability to be vulnerable and the ability to be in touch with one's own genuine pain and to be in touch with our intuition and where our boundaries are. Now, on the other hand, anti-victims mentality, the positive thing about that is being able to not be at the mercy of the emotions, being able to overcome things, being able to take responsibility for things in our lives. And so basically, when we can have these positive qualities coming together from both of these unhealthy polarities, that's what we want. And so what we want is the negative elements of victims mentality to be tempered out by the positive elements of anti-victims mentality. So the negative element of victims mentality is not facing their own power and responsibility. So the facing with power and responsibility is something that someone with anti-victims mentality does very well. Now, on the other side, we have a kind of callousness problem for somebody who's in anti-victims mentality. And this callousness makes them numb to their own pain and suffering and not facing with their own vulnerabilities and weaknesses, and then not really respecting the vulnerabilities of other people and kind of blaming other people for their own pain and suffering. And so, on the other hand, it's like that sensitivity that those with victims mentality tend to have, a sensitivity to their own suffering in particular, might be something that's quite helpful for somebody who's polarized over into anti-victims mentality. So we want to cultivate both sensitivity and responsibility while not being callous and not being in a state of learned helplessness. Anyway, so that's all I have for you for now. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, go ahead, click the like button below and subscribe and leave me a comment down below. Also, just a reminder again, today is the last day to sign up for the Consciousness Workers Club membership site until January. So basically, this is the last day for fall enrollment. So I'll leave again a link down below in the description and a link down below in the comments so that you can sign up there if you're interested. And as of tomorrow, the day after I'm posting this, I'll also switch that link out to a waiting list so that if you didn't get a chance to enroll this time, but you're interested to enroll in the next time around, then you'll have your name on the waiting list and you'll get notifications about it. Anyway, so that's all I have for now, and until next time, keep becoming more you.